Welcome to the winter where hunger had a heartbeat, where snow fell not as mercy, but as ash. Leningrad, 1942. A city surrounded by silence, its breath frozen mid-prayer, its people trapped between steel and starvation. They called it a siege, but it was more than that. It was a slow execution wrapped in snow. Inside the city walls, 2 million souls fought not against the enemy outside, but against the emptiness inside themselves. Streets once echoing with parades now whispered with boots that cracked over frost and bone. The bread lines vanished. The rations turned into dust. And when the bread was gone, they boiled leather. When the leather was gone, they boiled hope. This was the winter when people began to cook their shoes. You heard that right, their shoes. The boots that once walked them to work, to war, to weddings, now melted in battered pots, simmering in silence as prayers replaced recipes. The air smelled of glue wax and smoke. Windows were sealed with frost, and candles burned low beside ration cards worth less than paper. Some called it survival. Others called it madness. But in Leningrad, madness was the only meal left. Imagine walking through Nevsky Prospect, the grand avenue of poets and painters, and hearing not music, but the faint creak of sleds pulling the dead toward makeshift graves dug into frozen earth. The snow did not fall softly that year. It hit like shards of glass. Every breath stung. Every heartbeat cost calories you didn't have. And still the city refused to die. The Germans waited for it to collapse. It never did. Instead, it boiled its own shoes and prayed that hunger would forget their names. The diaries would later whisper the truth no broadcast could. Mothers tearing wallpaper from the walls, licking the glue for starch. Soldiers chewing their belts until leather softened into pulp. Children trading buttons for crumbs of frozen dough. The sound of pots bubbling wasn't cooking. It was desperation given shape. This was not fiction, not myth, not propaganda. It was what happens when an entire city becomes a single stomach screaming for mercy. Now close your eyes, picture the map. December 1941. The city of Leningrad trapped by a steel ring of German divisions, cut off from roads, from supply, from sunlight. The river Neva frozen solid, a white grave stretching to the horizon. The only route in or out now known as the Road of Life, a narrow ice corridor where trucks slipped between artillery shells to bring bread that weighed less than a dream. And every night explosions rippled across the frozen lake, and every morning fewer trucks came back. Yet still the city refused to fall. Even as the temperature dropped below 40 degrees, even as bodies froze where they stood in line for bread, even as families ate candle wax, even as voices faded mid-sentence, they endured. Before we begin, leave a comment where you're watching from and the exact second this silence reached you. Because what you're about to hear isn't just history, it's a heartbeat that never stopped. You see, war is loud, but hunger is quieter. It doesn't march, it waits. It doesn't shoot, it erases. It turns men into ghosts long before they die. In Leningrad, that silence was absolute, not even birds stayed. Diaries mention the absence of wings, as if the sky itself refused to look down. A mother wrote, "The world has forgotten us. Even the wind sounds afraid." But she was wrong. The world didn't forget, it just couldn't imagine. Imagine lighting a candle in an apartment where frost blooms on the inside of the walls. The window pane splits with ice. You melt the candle after it burns, pour the wax into a tin cup, and swallow it because it's warmer than air. Imagine waking to find the bread rations reduced again. 25 grams per day, a piece smaller than your hand made not from flour, but from sawdust and cellulose. People weighed their crumbs like gold, like faith itself. One girl wrote, "We stopped talking about tomorrow. We only talk about the next bite." Every story begins with fire, but this one begins with smoke from leather. The smell clung to the stairwells, to the sleeves of soldiers, to the breath of mothers who boiled belts and shoes until glue separated from flesh. They said it tasted like nothing. Nothing that was the flavor of survival. And still, the records show the theaters opened once a week just to remind the living what breathing sounded like. A violin played to an audience of bones wrapped in blankets. The conductor fainted mid-song, but the orchestra never stopped. Outside, shells screamed across the sky, but inside someone whispered, "Play louder than the hunger." That's where our story begins, in the coldest winter of the human soul. A city where courage wore hunger's face. A war where death learned patience. Leningrad, the city that boiled its own shoes and still walked forward. Before we dive in, tell me, where are you listening from? What does silence sound like where you are? Because after this, you'll never hear silence the same way again. January 1942. The cold had a name now. It was called Leningrad. The city no longer breathed in air, but in smoke, hunger, and frost. The war had sealed it shut like a tomb of glass. To the west, German artillery thundered day and night, shaking the Neva River until ice cracked like ribs. To the east, the forest burned where convoys once ran. Every bridge was cut, every road mined. The world outside the city might as well have vanished. All that remained was a white horizon and the echo of boots that no longer marched. Leningrad, once the proud jewel of Russia, was now a labyrinth of snow and ghosts. The statues along Nevsky Prospect stood wrapped in sandbags, blindfolded by frost. The grand theaters, the libraries, the cathedrals, all silent now, their ceilings dripping with ice, their pews filled not with worshippers, but with those too weak to stand. The blockade had begun in September of the previous year. Hitler's order was clear: Leningrad must be erased. But erasure takes time, and winter would do the rest. The temperature dropped below -40. The city's power plants went dark. The water pipes froze solid. The bakeries had no flour. The hospitals had no heat. Inside apartments, people burned furniture, books, even door frames, just to keep a flicker of flame alive. The sound of wood cracking was no longer the sound of construction. It was survival breaking its own walls. In the mornings, ration lines snaked across the squares, thin, trembling bodies wrapped in rags, waiting for a scrap of bread that might never come. Bread made of anything that could stretch the flour. Sawdust, linseed, cellulose. One old woman remembered. It smelled like earth. It tasted like grief. The lines were silent. Nobody spoke because every word wasted energy. People leaned on each other, not out of affection, but so they wouldn't fall. Those who did often stayed down. Across the frozen Neva, artillery echoed like heartbeats. The city's factories still worked somehow, making shells and rifles. The workers were skeletons in coats too large for them, hands cracked, eyes hollow. But machines still turned. For the motherland, they said, though, the motherland was starving too. Children carried water in buckets heavier than themselves. Soldiers patrolled streets that no longer needed guarding. The enemy was not at the gates anymore. The enemy was in the stomach. Yet in the midst of this silence, there was rhythm. The radio still broadcast symphonies. The city orchestra, led by starving men and women, performed Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony. The Leningrad. The notes were thin, trembling, but they carried through the air like defiance itself. The musicians fainted between movements. The audience wept quietly, not from beauty, but from recognition. That performance was recorded on cracked reels carried through the lines to Moscow, proof that the city still existed. Proof that death had not yet won. Somewhere in the Vasilyevsky district, a mother tore pages from a prayer book and boiled them for her children. A soldier wrote home to say he dreamed of soup, but when he woke he couldn't remember what it looked like. A doctor at hospital number 33 kept notes on the symptoms of hunger: loss of memory, loss of fear, loss of voice. In one line he wrote, "Patients no longer ask for food, they ask for sleep." The winter light was brief, only a few gray hours before the sky darkened again. In that dimness, people became shadows of themselves. They moved slowly, conserving motion, conserving breath. The sound of a single step echoed across entire blocks. Entire families shared one room, one candle, one dream that the road of life, the frozen path across Lake Ladoga, would bring more trucks, more bread, more tomorrow. The trucks came, but the shells came faster. Some sank through the ice, their headlights glowing beneath the frozen water like eyes that refused to close. Still, drivers volunteered every night, whispering, "We drive for the living." The Germans called it a victory of endurance. The Soviets called it resistance. For those inside, there was no name, only days measured in crumbs. Soldiers ate frozen horse meat when they could find it. Civilians ate glue paste wallpaper. anything that could trick the body into believing it was alive. People scraped frost from windows and melted it for tea. The snow turned gray from smoke and the smell of boiling leather drifted through the stairwells. Diaries describe it in one word: bitterness. And yet, even as the city starved, it refused to surrender. The banners still hung on government buildings, flapping in the cold. The loudspeakers still played news reports, saying Leningrad fights on. And it did in the factories, in the hospitals, in kitchens, where families huddled around pots of water, pretending to cook something. Faith became currency. Hope became food. And somewhere deep inside, a collective promise formed: we will not let them erase us. By February, the snow had piled higher than the windows. Corpses lay under it, frozen solid, their shapes softened by frost. No one buried them anymore. The ground was too hard. Names disappeared. Records froze. But in that stillness, something defied decay. Each street, each frozen stair, each pot of boiling glue became an altar not to God, but to endurance itself. The cold scraped at their lungs, hunger gnawed at their minds, and yet life clung on. A soldier recalled seeing a woman walking barefoot across the snow, her feet wrapped in rags, carrying a loaf smaller than her hand. She smiled, he said. It looked impossible. In that smile, perhaps, was the last rebellion left. This was not merely a siege. It was a world paused between heartbeat and silence. A city buried under its own breath. And when spring finally came, the thaw revealed what winter had hidden: streets of ghosts, diaries frozen in ice, words half-written, thoughts interrupted. History would later call it the Hunger Winter. But those who survived never called it anything. They didn't have to. Because everyone who lived through it knew the moment you give it a name, it begins to sound survivable. And nothing about that winter ever was. The records are clear. The numbers, the names, the handwriting, all still exist, frozen in Soviet archives and private diaries that survived when their authors did not. Between September 1941 and January 1944, 872 days of isolation sealed Leningrad into a human experiment of endurance. The statistics alone are unbearable: over 1 million civilians dead, more than half from starvation, thousands more from cold and disease. The temperature in January 1942 reached 40 degrees Celsius. The daily ration, officially set by Decree number 856 of the Executive Committee, fell to 125 grams of bread for workers and 75 grams for dependents. But it wasn't bread. Laboratory tests after the siege revealed that flour made up less than half of it. The rest was cellulose, sawdust, and even ground cottonseed from factory waste. In factory notebooks, supervisors wrote the same words again and again: output decreasing, workers fainting. A typist at the Kirov works died at her desk. Her hands were still on the keys when they found her. Hospital records from January list hunger, edema, body exhaustion, loss of sight, stomach paralysis. The city's morgues overflowed. Corpses were loaded onto sleds and dragged through the streets to common pits dug into frozen earth. People learned to step aside when sleds passed. No one cried. Tears froze too quickly. The city's water system failed in the first weeks. Residents melted snow in buckets over stoves that smoked black. With power gone, factories that once produced tanks now dismantled their own machinery for fuel. The Leningrad bread factory became the epicenter of survival. It baked thousands of loaves every day, each smaller, each darker. Inside the factory, bakers collapsed beside the ovens. They wrote ration counts in pencil because ink froze. When flour ran out, they ground flaxseed, then bark, then wallpaper paste. Official memos between City Command and the State Defense Committee show the tone of desperation. Supplies through Lake Ladoga are insufficient. Civilians dying faster than expected. Recommend reduction of rations for non-workers. The response from Moscow was simple: hold Leningrad. The diaries tell the rest. Tanya Savacheva, 11 years old, wrote the most famous one. A tiny notebook with 7 sentences. Zhenya died on December 28, 1941. Grandmother died on January 25, 1942. Lika died on March 17th. Uncle Vasya died on April 13th. Uncle Lisha died on May 10th. Mother died on May 13th. Savachevs are dead. Only Tanya is left. Her notebook became evidence in the Nuremberg trials. Tanya did not survive the evacuation. An adult diary, that of Olga Grekina, describes, "February, we boiled belts today. The glue softened after 6 hours. It smelled of burnt rubber. It filled the room. We drank it anyway." Another by Sergeant Nikolai Evseyev of the 42nd Division notes, "Rations 2 ounces bread. 1 spoon porridge. Comrade Ivanov collapsed during shift. Buried in snow near plant. Commander says production must continue. The handwriting grows smaller each day until it stops mid-sentence." The Leningrad Medical Institute kept meticulous notes. Doctors described stage 3 starvation, weight loss beyond 40%, skin turning blue-gray gums, bleeding heart slowing to 30 beats per minute. They measured the pulse of patients with no strength left to move. In one file, a doctor wrote, "I cannot lift the pen. We are all subjects of our own study." Still, there were attempts to preserve normal life. The Philharmonic Hall reopened on August 9, 1942. The performance of Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony was broadcast by loudspeakers to the front lines. German intercepts recorded it and noted Leningrad plays while starving. The orchestra rehearsed between air raids. Musicians wore gloves with the fingers cut off. Their pay 300 grams of bread. For many, it was the only food that week. Across the city, factories continued production. In December 1941, 1,000 artillery shells and 800 machine guns left Leningrad daily, assembled by workers who could barely stand. The NKVD reports mention incidents of collapse during work shifts, a euphemism for death. Still, no one was allowed to stop. Every worker, a soldier, that was the motto. Letters smuggled through the ice road told another story. A mother wrote to her son on the front, "I cooked the glue. It holds us together more than it held the furniture." A teacher described her classroom, 5 students remain. They do not speak. They just stare at the blackboard. Many of those letters never reached their destination. In March 1942, relief convoys began crossing Lake Ladoga more regularly. The road of life Doroga Zhizny stretched across 30 kilometers of ice. Trucks carried flour, salt, and coal and returned loaded with evacuees. German aircraft bombed the route daily. Drivers painted white crosses on their windshields and drove with headlights off. Survivors said the ice groaned beneath the weight, cracking like ribs under artillery fire. The archives list 6,000 trucks lost. When spring came, the thaw revealed layers of tragedy. Thousands of bodies were buried beneath snowdrifts in parks and courtyards. Official recovery teams documented them in ledgers female approx. 30 weight, 28 kilograms cause dystrophy. The handwriting is precise, detached, bureaucratic compassion. Photographs show rows of boots beside open graves, some empty, some cut apart for soup. By the end of 1942, death slowed not because food returned, but because there were fewer left to die. Ration levels increased in small increments, 50 grams, then 400. The siege continued another year and a half, but the worst was over. When the blockade finally broke in January 1944, the surviving population was less than half the original. Out of every 2 citizens, 1 was gone. Yet in the ruins, the factories resumed, the schools reopened, and the bread ovens burned again. The documents close with one final report signed February 1944, "Leningrad has fulfilled its duty. The city lives." They did not write how. They did not need to. Long after the guns fell silent, people said the city still whispered. The siege of Leningrad ended in January 1944, but its echoes never left. Survivors would not call them ghosts, they called them shadows of hunger. Every district had its story, every apartment a silence that seemed to breathe. In the years that followed, rumors began to spread not from superstition, but from memory refusing to fade. They said at night, when the river froze again, you could still hear the sound of boiling, a slow, steady bubbling under the ice, as if the city itself was cooking its own past. At first, these tales were quiet, told between neighbors, passed down in kitchens, rebuilt from ashes. People believed that the city had a soul, a heavy, patient soul that remembered everything. The smell of burned glue, they said, never truly left the walls. You could wash them, paint them, rebuild them. But every winter, when the frost crept back, it returned faint, chemical bitter. Some claimed it wasn't smell at all, but a memory the body carried. When the temperature dropped below -30, people would feel it again in their throats, the taste of boiled leather. In Vasilyevsky Island, they told stories of a woman who kept an empty pot on her stove for decades. Her neighbors heard her whispering to it each night, thanking it for saving her children. When she died, the pot was found spotless, polished, until it reflected the light like glass. In another building, a child refused to sleep without a small piece of bread under her pillow. Her grandmother told her, "It keeps the silence away." That child grew up to become a teacher, and she never once threw away food. The folklore of Leningrad isn't built on ghosts that haunt, but on habits that never died. Even in the 1970s, researchers noted that elderly residents of the city would hoard flour sugar matches. They couldn't explain why. Just in case, they said, but what they meant was in case the world forgets again. The city's museums began collecting these rituals. At the Museum of the Defense of Leningrad, one exhibit displays a single piece of bread, 25 grams, sealed behind glass, hard as stone. Tour guides whisper, "This was life." Visitors rarely speak. Some cry quietly as if in church. But folklore goes deeper than ritual. There are the sounds, the phantom noises, that generations have sworn to hear. The tram bell that rings, though no trams pass. The muffled symphony drifting through snow on certain nights. Scientists call it wind, but residents say it's the echo of Shostakovich's Seventh, the symphony performed during the blockade. The radio towers that broadcasted it still stand red lights blinking in the dark. Sometimes people say when the power flickers you can catch a bar of the melody faint, distorted as if time itself is playing it back. There is also the story of the breadline girl. The archives mention her only once, a young woman who died standing frozen upright in a ration line still holding her card. When they found her, her eyes were open, her hand outstretched, as if reaching for something. After the war, the site of that bakery was rebuilt. Workers claimed to feel a cold draft in one corner of the room, even in summer. They said the air smelled of rye. Each year, someone would leave a small loaf near that wall, no one knew who. Priests and historians later described the siege as a holy trial. In church records, priests wrote sermons about endurance as a form of sanctity. One wrote, "If bread became divine, then hunger became its prophet." It was not blasphemy, it was survival theology. Many survivors decades later said they no longer prayed for comfort, only for memory. Forgetfulness, one old woman said, is the second death. That line became part of local proverbs. Children learned it in school, without knowing who first said it. As time passed, Leningrad became St. Petersburg again, and the wounds of the siege were folded into monuments and memorials. Yet each January during the week of the blockades, lifting candles still burn along the Neva embankments. They say the wax drips slower there, as if even fire remembers how cold it once was. During those nights, the city becomes silent again. Cars stop, footsteps hush, and you can hear the sound of breathing. Not human breathing, but something larger, the sound of a city alive through memory. Folklore also lives in art. Painters spoke of using ash from their grandparents' fireplaces in pigments to capture the color of hunger gray. Writers described streets as if they were veins frozen in glass. The siege became mythology, not because people exaggerated it, but because no one could fully explain it. When survivors spoke, their voices carried pauses, long, haunted silences that said more than words. The hardest part, one man said, was not eating the bread, but stopping once you started. And then there is the legend of the eternal pot. In 1943, a factory worker named Anna Petrova supposedly donated her last pot to a museum. The curator wrote that when he touched it, it was still warm, though it had been cold for months. The story spread. The pot became symbol relic myth. It was said to boil on its own during memorial services, steam rising without fire. No one proved it. No one needed to. Historians separate fact from legend, but in Leningrad they coexist. The hunger didn't just kill it, rewrote human instinct. It left behind gestures that no time can erase, counting crumbs before eating them, kissing a slice of bread before taking the first bite. For those who lived through it, bread was no longer food, it was prayer, history, forgiveness. Today, when snow falls over St. Petersburg, it covers the same streets where those prayers were whispered. Children build snowmen where soldiers once froze in line. Tourists take photos on Nevsky Prospect, unaware that beneath the cobblestones lie layers of history, some written, some buried, some breathing still. The city has rebuilt itself 100 times, but winter always returns carrying the same quiet question. What does survival cost? And somewhere beneath all the marble and light, the city answers not in words, but in warmth. The kind that comes not from fire, but from the simple act of remembering. The story of Leningrad did not end when the blockade lifted. It became a mirror for every city that ever faced the silence of siege. What happened there was not an isolated tragedy, but a pattern in human history. The same hunger, the same cold, the same stubborn will to remain. Historians would later call it the universal code of survival. The facts repeat across centuries, across continents, only the names change. When the Red Army finally broke through the German lines in January 1944, Leningrad lay in ruins. Yet its endurance would soon echo in places far from the Neva River. Scholars in post-war Europe compared it to earlier sieges: Vicksburg in 1863, Verdun in 1916, Warsaw in 1939, Stalingrad in 1942, and much later, Sarajevo in the 1990s. In each, civilians became the front line. Hunger replaced bullets. Time replaced bombs. Leningrad became the textbook, the warning, and the legend. Letters from survivors were translated and read by soldiers who fought elsewhere. They all spoke of the same sensations: the dull ache in the stomach, the way sound disappeared, the strange calm when fear ran out. At Verdun, men wrote about eating candle wax to stay alive. At Vicksburg, soldiers boiled mules, horses, even rats. The words are eerily identical. We boiled what was left. In Leningrad, they boiled leather. In other places, they boiled memory itself, anything to make the silence chewable. In Soviet archives, commanders compared the spirit of the siege to ancient examples: the Spartans at Thermopylae, the defenders of Masada. But Leningrad's story was different. It was not about heroes in armor or banners of victory. It was about people who refused to stop breathing. Men who worked in frozen factories. Women who wrote in diaries instead of screaming. Children who stood in bread lines until they turned to stone. Survival became a collective prayer. After the war, Moscow ordered new housing to replace the ruins, but many citizens refused to move. They stayed in the same apartments where their families had died. When asked why, one woman said, "Because the walls know us." In that answer lies the bridge between history and legend. The endurance of Leningrad became a form of faith, not in miracles, but in memory. Researchers studying trauma later found something remarkable. Families who lived through the blockade showed a shared behavior passed through generations: rationing, storing food, keeping emergency candles. The descendants called it habit. Psychologists called it genetic memory. The siege had written itself into their bodies. Decades later, grandchildren who had never known hunger still felt uneasy seeing an empty cupboard. It was as if the city's fear had been inherited, encoded in silence. Other nations studied Leningrad not just as military history, but as a lesson in civilian resistance. The British used its data to design urban survival plans. The United Nations cited it in early humanitarian policies. The image of a city starving but not surrendering became an emblem, proof that endurance could be stronger than weapons. When the siege of Sarajevo began half a century later, journalists compared it immediately. People there read the diaries of Leningrad to find courage. If they survived, so can we, they said. The same cold, the same sound of shelling, the same hunger, different century, same defiance. Even within Russia, Leningrad's story connected to other forgotten fronts. Villages near Smolensk, Bryansk, and Novgorod faced similar starvation. Records describe peasants boiling bark, collecting snow for soup. Yet none of them reached the same mythic scale. Leningrad was the city that would not die, and that reputation carried a price. For decades, survivors were celebrated, but also silenced. Soviet propaganda turned their suffering into slogans: courage, sacrifice, victory. The real diaries, the ones that spoke of despair, were hidden away. Only after the collapse of the Soviet Union were they published in full. Then the world heard their true voices, plain, exhausted, unbearably human. One entry by a nurse named Vera Timofeeva reads, "The worst sound was not the bombs, but the spoon scraping an empty pot." Another from a soldier guarding the bread convoy. "Each step forward cost a heartbeat. We counted both." These sentences connect the siege to every war, since not through politics, but through pain. Hunger erases nationality. Cold has no ideology. And so the bridge expands through time. From Leningrad to Aleppo, from Stalingrad to Mariupol, cities caught between walls and winter. The lessons are the same. Food becomes history's first casualty. Civilians become the last soldiers. And memory becomes the only weapon that never runs out. When the power goes dark, the silence returns, asking the same question. How far will humans go to stay human? Today, the road of life. The ice route across Lake Ladoga is marked by memorial stones. Truck engines from the 1940s lie preserved in the snow, still stained with oil. Every winter, volunteers retrace that path, walking in silence to honor the dead. They carry small loaves of bread wrapped in paper. Some drop them into the ice cracks, offerings to those who never made it across. The ritual repeats every January, linking past to present. That is the bridge. Not just between wars, but between people who remember and those who cannot imagine. The siege of Leningrad stands as the thread running through centuries of human endurance, a reminder that civilization's strength is not in victory, parades, or speeches, but in the quiet, frozen defiance of those who refuse to vanish. When you stand on the Neva today watching the ice drift under gray light, it is easy to believe that history sleeps beneath it. But the city still moves, still breathes, still remembers. And if you listen long enough beneath the hum of traffic and the music of tourists, you can hear it, that faint rhythmic sound of survival crossing the ages. January 1944. The blockade was breaking. The city that had lived through 872 days of siege was finally beginning to breathe again. But freedom did not come with trumpets or banners. It came with silence. The German artillery that had roared across the Neva went quiet, one battery at a time. Snow began to fall gently, without the thunder of explosions behind it. Yet no one in Leningrad smiled. No one ran into the streets. The people who survived were too weak to cheer, too cold to cry. They simply stood at their windows and listened to the silence as if unsure whether to trust it. The official order from the Soviet command reached the front lines on the morning of January 27th. The ring was broken. The blockade of Leningrad had ended. But inside the city, it felt unreal. Many residents had stopped believing in endings. They had learned that survival came 1 hour at a time. Still, the soldiers of the Second Shock Army marched in skeletal figures wrapped in rags, greeted by civilians who looked no different. "We did not know who were soldiers and who were ghosts," a survivor later wrote. Everyone looked the same. The first bread truck entered through the southern road that day. It was small, its paint scorched by shrapnel. A soldier carried a loaf in both hands like a relic. The crowd that gathered did not rush forward. They watched silent until one elderly woman reached out and touched it. Then she crossed herself. A cheer began, faint at first, then rising not of joy, but of disbelief. People had forgotten what bread smelled like. Across the city, the evidence of what had happened lay everywhere. Entire districts were hollowed out. Apartment walls had collapsed inward. In stairwells, frozen bodies sat where they had fallen, perfectly preserved by the cold. Morgue workers stopped counting after the 100,000th entry. The population, once more than 2.5 million, had fallen below 700,000. Many of those were too weak to walk. Hospitals overflowed with patients suffering from dystrophy, the final stage of starvation. Doctors recorded their weights in the margins of ration cards: 28 kilos, 31 kilos, 34 kilos. Some wrote simply unmeasurable. Yet the human instinct to rebuild began almost immediately. Firefighters cleared snow from the streets with shovels made from metal scraps. Children gathered pieces of paper and wood to light fires. The smell of smoke, this time from warmth, not hunger, began to fill the air again. The Red Army conducted burial details across the city. Tens of thousands of bodies were moved to mass graves at Piskaryovskoye Cemetery. There, the first memorial service was held in March 1944. Survivors brought flowers made of fabric because real flowers would not grow for another year. One nurse described the scene: "We stood in lines again, just like for bread. Only now it was for graves. Rows upon rows of wooden markers stretched into the distance. Some bore names, most did not. Soldiers carried coffins on sleds while loudspeakers broadcast music by Shostakovich, the same Seventh Symphony that had played in the darkest days of the siege. The notes drifted over the snow, mixing with the wind. Those who listened said it felt like the city itself was breathing again, painfully slowly, but alive. When the first spring came after liberation, the thaw revealed what the snow had hidden. Streets cracked open, revealing cellars filled with makeshift stoves and blackened pots. In one building on Litany Prospect, workers found a pot still on the stove, half filled with water and strips of leather. Next to it lay a ration card dated January 10, 1942, the last week of the worst winter. Someone had written a single word on it: enough. The Soviet government declared the siege a symbol of national pride. Medals were minted, songs were written, and newspapers called it the unbreakable city. But those who lived through it avoided the word victory. There was no victory, one survivor said. There was only the end of dying. For decades afterward, they carried the habits of survival, saving crumbs, rationing sugar, hiding candles. Even after food returned, no one wasted a single bite. Hunger had become part of the city's rhythm, like a second heartbeat. International observers who entered Leningrad after liberation were stunned. The British war correspondent Alexander Werth described walking through silent streets, where every face looked carved from ice. He wrote, "No other city in history has endured such suffering and still remained alive." In his notes, he underlined one sentence 3 times. This was not a siege, it was a slow crucifixion. By summer, trains began arriving with flour and coal. Gardens were planted in the ruins. Bread production resumed in full. The first batch was distributed on May 1st, symbolic deliberate. Each citizen received a loaf of white bread, soft and warm. Many refused to eat it immediately. They kept it on the table, staring at it for hours, afraid that if they touched it, it might vanish. That year, a photographer named Boris Kudryarov captured one of the most famous images of post-siege Leningrad: a young girl sitting beside her grandmother, both holding a piece of bread in their hands. They do not smile. The girl's eyes are calm, but her fingers clutch the bread tightly, as though holding the entire weight of the city. The caption beneath the photo read, "She learned early what bread means." When the victory parade came in 1945, the survivors of Leningrad walked at the very end. They did not march in formation. They shuffled slowly, carrying candles and portraits of those who hadn't made it. People on the sidewalks bowed their heads as they passed. There was no applause, only silence, because everyone in Russia knew without Leningrad, there would have been no victory at all. Years later, the Leningrad Survivors Committee would meet each winter. They sat around tables telling stories, quietly pouring tea into chipped cups. Every meeting ended the same way, with a moment of silence. One woman always whispered before leaving, "We boiled our shoes, but we never boiled our souls." And that was the true climax of Leningrad's story, not the breaking of the blockade, not the medals, not the slogans, but the simple, impossible fact that a city starved almost to death and still remembered how to be human. Time moves, but the snow remembers. 80 years have passed since the blockade ended, yet Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, still breathes in a rhythm that feels older than the war itself. The city has rebuilt its walls, its bridges, its cathedrals, but every winter when the Neva freezes and the air sharpens, the old heartbeat returns. It lives in the quiet habits of its people, the way they save crumbs, the way they wrap bread carefully, the way they pause before eating, as if to thank something unseen. Along the river stands Piskaryovskoye Cemetery, 500,000 buried under a single field of snow. There are no grand statues there, only a long stone wall carved with a single line: "No one is forgotten, nothing is forgotten." Every January 27th, people still come with candles and pieces of black bread. They do not speak. The silence itself is the prayer. The flame trembles in the wind the same way it did when the siege ended. And when it goes out, no one relights it. Because here, even darkness has earned its rest. What the siege left behind is not just history, it's inheritance. The survivors taught their children that freedom is fragile, that hunger can return in many forms. Some say it comes back as greed, some as indifference. Every generation learns its own version of the blockade. Sometimes it's war, sometimes it's silence, sometimes it's simply forgetting. Modern St. Petersburg glows at night now, its bridges lit, its streets alive with music. But beneath the sound of life, there's still that deeper pulse. The same city that once boiled its own shoes now feeds millions of tourists. Yet its true monument is invisible, a memory that refuses to vanish. If you walk there at dawn, when the city is still blue and the river breathes mist, you can hear it faint, steady, unbroken, the heartbeat of those who refuse to die. It says nothing heroic, nothing loud. Only this: we were here, we endured. Maybe hunger never left. Maybe it simply changed its name into faith, into endurance, into the quiet promise that as long as someone remembers, the city still lives. You've just listened to another file from Classified Chronicles. If the echoes of Leningrad stayed with you tonight, subscribe and remember with us.